Maximilien, who is an associate professor at the University of Tokyo, and we have Samuel Oyewole, who is a postdoctoral research fellow at University of Pretoria, and then we have Shadrach Kundi. Shadrach, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. And he is Director of Research at the African Center for International Affairs. And then we have Arnold Agaba, who is the chair of the research group on air and space law at McGill University. So we are very happy to have this very diverse, interesting panel in terms of their different academic focus. But I think one thing that quite unites all of them is that they're all academics. So it's really great. This is the first time I'll be having an all academic panel. So very interesting insights from them that will be coming, so they can talk more about their work when they start their discussions. So we are going to start the conversation with Shadrach, and Shadrach is just going to give us a background and a foundation to actually discuss more about the topic of today. Thank you so much, Shadrach, and the floor is yours. Shadrach, I think you're muted if you're trying to speak. I can't hear you.
So I'm trying to share my screen.
Oh, okay. Does it allow you to?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, great.
Can you see?
Oh, yes, the colors. Lovely.
All right. So in beginning the conversation, I want to start by giving a short presentation on the presence of Pan-Africanism beyond the formal institution frameworks that exist within the African continent and beyond, which regards to Pan-Africanism. If we are saying Pan-Africanism, we are looking at a simultaneous intellectual and cultural, social, and political movements with more artistic projects that calls for the unification and the liberation of the people of African ancestry, both on the continent of Africa and the African diaspora. And these definitional terms should not be constricted within the struggle just against racism, colonialism, capitalism, and leaving out the issue of Pan-African women and their struggle against sexism and gender justice in the left. So basically to give an all-encompassing view about Pan-Africanism. But we cannot discuss Pan-Africanism without talking about the foundational roots that created what we now know as Pan-Africanism. It dates back to 3100 BCE, when the African people were the cradle of civilization, grounding the various fundamentals within the development space in terms of arts, in terms of science, in terms of mathematics, in terms of engineering, all these civilizations that were embedded in Africa, including the Egyptian civilization, the Nubian civilization, and Axumite civilization, and various civilizations that existed on the continent of Africa. That formed the basis for the civilization that we enjoy today. Beyond that, there was a disconnect or some form of break with regards to the history of Africa, where Africans were subjected to slavery, slave trade, to feed the mercantilist ideals of the Western society. And this took place between 1400 and 1800 in those periods. So after 1888, where slaves were not important as a result of the Industrial Revolution, there was another form of exploitation that took place within the continent of Africa, which started as a result of Africa and Western societies meeting at Berlin and dividing Africa like cake and sharing it among themselves for the purposes of exploiting the natural resources in order to feed their industries. So that brought about the whole call for Pan-Africanism in the context where we find it for the purposes of liberating the African people from racism, liberating the African people from colonialism, liberating the African people from issues regarding sexism and capitalism within the broader scheme of things. So these founding fathers, who we tout as the trailblazers of Pan-Africanism, started this whole project outside the shores of Africa, but has become the birthright of Africa. It took place with the lives of different periods in which we may refer them to an ideational period and a movement period. So the ideational period started between around 1776 to around 1900, where the whole idea of Pan-Africanism was birthed, the whole idea of Pan-Africanism was formed, and the movement with which Pan-Africanism was to take place with the teachings and the advocacy of people like Marcus Garvey and Henry Sylvester William and the rest. Beyond that, the movement period came in which the materialization of Pan-Africanism took place with the conferences that took place between 1900 and 1958. And amongst them, in 1900, Henry Sylvester William organized the first Pan-African conference in London, and it was attended by a couple of Africans, including the likes of Bishop Alexander Walter, including the likes of Anna Julia Cooper. And beyond that, there was another Paris conference that took place in 1919, organized by Webb Du Bois and Les Biadi. And Webb Du Bois here, we always tout him as the father of Pan-Africanism because of his exceptional works that he has contributed to the Pan-African cause within the broader spectrum. Amongst these Pan-African conferences that took place or took precedence in outside the shores of Africa, when you come to connecting Pan-Africanism to the African people, it more resonated within the last conference that took place in 1935 in Manchester, which was attended by some of the leaders who became liberation leaders for independence for Africa, including the likes of Jomo Kenyatta, including the likes of our own Kwame Nkrumah from Ghana, including the likes of Banda Hastings from Malawi. And the main organizers also include the likes of George Padmore and W.E.B. Du Bois. But we cannot talk about Pan-Africanism taking away the human factor that comes to play if we want to talk about Pan-Africanism as a uniting front. And we cannot forget about the contribution of people like Anna Julia Cooper, Mary Church Terrell, Fanny Barrier William, Ida Gibbs, and among several other women who were also part of the struggle for the African people to know their roots and also connect the African people to the international global system. So beyond the Manchester conference, brought out a whole new idea, a whole refreshing ideals for the purposes of liberating the African continent from colonialism and exploitation. And the lives of Kwame Nkrumah became one of the leading fronts for Pan-Africanism and also the liberation of the continent, tying down the foreign policy of Ghana to the broader scheme of liberating the entire African continent. And his speech on the eve of independence is something that strikes us as Ghanaians when he says that the independence of Ghana is meaningless until the entire African continent is liberated from colonialism. So beyond that, there was a disconnect, and such disconnect came in as a result of post-independence struggle.
Is everything okay, Shadrach?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, so the disconnect came in as a result of linking Pan-Africanism to the African people. And what I came as the dialectical dilemma between the African people and going into independence, of which someone like Kwame Nkrumah warned that if Africa is not totally united, if Africa is not totally amalgamated from the balkanized borders which have been drawn by the Western European people, we may go back to the issue of new colonialism to be a new form of colonialism of which we will not be colonialism with the oppressor in our midst, but the oppressor somewhere remotely controlling the affairs of Africa. And also beyond the independence struggle, we saw the infiltration of Western ideas that sought to distort and also pollute the distilled nature of Pan-African philosophy with the adoption and wholehearted infiltration of Western ideals of thinking, Western ideals of narrating the history of Africa, Western ideals of charting the path for the African people, directing us towards places that the Pan-African cause does not lead us into. And also the restriction of the knowledge production disjointed from the legacies of Pan-Africanism. And it came as a result of language systems where now we call ourselves Lusophone, we call ourselves Francophone countries, we call ourselves Anglophone countries. And it was a means towards dividing Africa totally and also conquering the African people through the external means or the remote means of using neo-colonialism and neo-imperialism. And beyond that, the dominance of neoliberalism interlaced in globalization also became something that distorted the whole idea of Pan-Africanism. And today, the African people have not been able to find their feet within the global space as a result of globalization embedded in neoliberalism, where neoliberalism will talk about opening up of markets, liberation of market forces, demand and supply, controlling the affairs of the economy, putting in structures that are supposed not to include the African people for themselves. So beyond that, the Pan-African, the formal institutional system which was created, including the likes of the Organization of the African Union, was not able to wholeheartedly reflect what Pan-Africanism has sought for to totally unite the people of Africa. On the eve of the formation of the OAU, there were several speeches that were given by the likes of Julius Nyerere, likes of Nnamdi Azikiwe, the rest, and one of them that stood out was that of Kwame Nkrumah, who called for a total unification of the African continent, where the African continent will have a unified armed forces, where the African continent will have a single government, where the African continent will have a single language, which will be a system that seeks to unite Africa wholeheartedly and bring about the liberation that we sought for. Yes, the Organization of African Unity was able to deliver its mandate on liberation of the African people from colonialism. That is one of the achievements that we associate with the Organization of African Unity. However, there was a restructuring of the African unity in which we came back to, we came into the era of the African Union. And with the African Union, we sought, or the African people seek to liberate the African people from the shackles of the oppressors by way of charting new path towards development, which the Agenda 2063, in which the African Union has come by as a means towards sustainably developing the African continent. Yet there are certain distortions with the Agenda 2063 because of the mandate with which it was formed. It was supposed to be formed on the mandate of the bottom-up approach, yet this does not resonate with the ordinary African person that you meet. They do not have any sense of connection with the whole continental agenda towards sustainably developing the African continent. And what will resonate or what will reawaken the African people beyond the formalism that has been created? One is as a result of the factors from the failure of the Western state system in Africa to be able to deliver development, to be able to cater for the human security needs of the people, and comprehensively catering for the African needs. Also, the structural challenges that is created as a result of the exploitative state of imperialism, which has resulted in the lack of food sovereignty and energy sovereignty within the continent. About 40% of the continent's food is imported, and it does not give the continent any respite when it comes to food sovereignty. Also, 600 million Africans do not have access to electricity, and it questions the whole idea of industrialization within the continent. And also the indebted nature of the African people is also something that comes to question within the broader scheme of things. And beyond that, the reflection of the agency of Africa, that Africa has agency within the broader scheme of conversation with the rest of the world. We've not been able to materialize what we have for the purposes of asserting our agency, even within current times where Africa should be able to set itself in terms of having enough resources to be able to charter a sustainable future in terms of terms of that's my last thing.
Yeah, I was just going to say if you could, just sum it up so that
Yeah, so the whole issue of the African agency, we having the manpower, we having the resources, and we having the knowledge to be able to accept ourselves. Yes, we've not been able to do that, even within the scheme in which the international political economy has become diversified as a result of diversified partners to Africa, with the declining nature of Western partners within the African continent, introducing the likes of China, the likes of Turkey, the likes of the UAE within the continent. And a stark reflection of that was the kind of conversation that took place between Cyril Ramaphosa and Donald Trump during his visit to the United States.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Shadrach, for this really powerful foundation for the discussion going ahead. And I have some questions, but I'll just keep that during the panel session. Maybe we can come back to them when you talked about the Western state system and things like that. Thank you so much, Shadrach. And now I'm just going to invite Samuel and to just give us his own point of view and discussions on Pan-Africanism, and just take the conversation a bit further from the broad overview that Shadrach just gave us, more like into space. How do you see its relevance for space in Africa?
Thank you so much for having me here today, and let me start by appreciating Dr. Shadrach for the earlier and strong foundation he has laid. I think he has saved me a lot of, I don't want to use the word stress in time of laying that historical foundation. I think he has made my work very easy, and I just need to bridge the politics of Pan-Africanism and the issue of space discourse so that subsequent panelists can focus more on space issue. So to start with, the issue of Pan-Africanism has been well trashed out by the earlier discussant. And we like to reflect around issue of Pan-Africanism in outer space, in a streamlined context of outer space. And then for us to engage this debate, we may need to extract out the key features of Pan-Africanism that we want to look at for while discussing the subject of outer space in the continent. And then the key features that I identify include issue of unity. Pan-Africanism emphasizes the word unity of African state, of African people. So unity is central to the concept of Pan-Africanism. Another thing is solidarity. Pan-Africanism places so much emphasis on solidarity. What happened to one part of African country or African people anywhere across the world is believed to affect the whole African as a race and as a continent. So that solidarity is another key word that is very important in our any attempt to understand Pan-Africanism and its applicability in outer space discourse. Another thing is issue of brotherhood. African prefer or would like to refer to other African countries as fellow Africans, brothers, our Ghanaian brothers. Nigeria, we always say. South African, we always refer to Botswana, Zimbabwe as a brother. They are our brother. So this issue of brotherhood, which is also connected to issue of solidarity, all those things are relevant in our in applying this idea to space discourse. Another thing is anti-colonialism and anti-racism. The idea that there's a need to resist a domination of African continent politically and beyond. The discourse now extends beyond politics into scientific domain. So the idea of anti-colonialism, anti-imperialism is very central to Pan-Africanism. And another thing is empowerment of African people and liberation. It's also key the understanding of Pan-Africanism. And lastly is African agency, African actors acting in political, economic, socio-cultural spaces are very key to understanding of Pan-Africanism. How to bring this to space discourse? I would like, permit me to read, may not share my screen, but permit me to read a particular part of an agenda 2063 of the African Union. And that's Aspiration 7. And Aspiration 7 is on Africa as a strong, united, and influential global power and partner. Number 59 of that particular document states that Africa shall be a strong, united, resilient, peaceful, and influential global player and partner with a significant role in world affairs. We affirm the importance of African unity and solidarity in the face of continual external interference, including attempts to divide the continent and undue pressure and sanction on some countries. The second point under that, which fall under 60, is a major social, Africa shall be a major social, political, economic force in the world with a rightful share of global commons, including land, ocean, and space. It means that African founding father and strategists have this consciousness that there's a need for unity in for Africa to play its role, to rise up to play a major role and to be a force to reckon with in any discourse of global common, which include issue of land, ocean, and space. And that shows the sensitivities to this issue of Pan-Africanism. Issue of solidarity was emphasized, unity was emphasized, and other key ingredients that I earlier identified with Pan-Africanism. So now if we take this further down, there are different dimensions that we can engage while discussing Pan-Africanism in outer space. I would like to just identify 3 dimensions for the purpose of this discussion. There is economic dimension, which is the liberal dimension of Pan-Africanism. There is socio-cultural dimension of possible or reality of Pan-Africanism in outer space, and the foreign policy dimension is more most salient dimension is the socio-cultural dimension. The socio-cultural dimension is very evident. Is evident in the context of educational tourism across Africa. Where there are many African citizens study in South Africa and vice versa in some other part of the continent. And through this process, many of these African citizens had the opportunity of being trained in different areas of space science and technology. This is an underestimated dimension of African Pan-Africanism. We always focus on big documents like what's African Union doing, what's the latest strategy, but we undermine this dimension, or we often underestimate this dimension of Pan-Africanism, the socio-cultural dimension, especially in the area of education, in the area of communication. Media, African media are playing major roles in educating African population about space. We have a number of actors in this area. I will soon get to discussion on actors in, that are involved in Pan-Africanism in outer space. And we have the like of Space in Africa that continue to churn out news that inform the general public about space and space content across the continent. So this socio-cultural dimension is very important. Another thing, and the second time we always pay less attention to this dimension also is then the economic dimension. We have a number of growing number of companies in Africa that are playing roles beyond their immediate boundary, connecting Africa together, either through communication. We have NISAT in Egypt, supporting radio and television program that transcend the immediate boundary of Egypt. We have NICOMSAT in Nigeria playing its own role. We have other minor and major space company supporting certain activities in the economic space that are connecting Africa in ways that we pay limited attention to as a general public. So another dimension, and that's the most pronounced dimension, is the political and policy dimension. We are all, most of us that have been following African Union strategy and then policy development around space, are aware of African space policy and African space strategy. That's the most popular dimension of space, Pan-Africanism. And again, if you pay attention to the content of some national space policy in Africa, you see element of Pan-Africanism in their objective, their desire to collaborate with the rest of the continent. These are indications of Pan-Africanism at the national level, and at the regional level, we can say this with the emergence of an African Space Agency and the policy that came earlier before that. So beyond this dimension, we have so many actors that are involved in Pan-Africanism, either as aspiration or that are the growing realization of Pan-Africanism as an objective in outer space. And those actors include intergovernmental actors like African Space Agency, the newly established African Space Agency. We have the likes of international non-governmental organizations like the likes of academic association in physics, in astronomy, and so many other fields that are relevant in engineering across Africa that are relevant to this area. And the technical committees, the scientific committee of other scientific committee of African Union and these sub-regional groups like ECOWAS, SADC, and the rest of them have certain contributions that are relevant to Pan-Africanism of science and technology in general and specifically in outer space. So, and beyond that, we have the private sector. We have a growing number of private sector or private actors or NGOs. Space Hub is one of them. This particular discussion is facilitated by Space Hub. It's one way to facilitate or encourage Pan-Africanism, bringing different Africans together to discuss the future of the continent in outer space. And this is a dimension that is connected to the socio-cultural dimension, building that consciousness of African identity in outer space. So these are different actors that are involved in Pan-Africanism as an idea and as in realization of this objective. In our last discussion on this platform, I think my last presentation was on between aspiration and reality. So, but now going further on this or building on that dichotomy, I noticed that many actors are making progress towards the realization of African aspiration in outer space. However, there are challenges. To ignore the challenges would be to assume that Africa have actually arrived or achieve the desired objective of Pan-Africanism in outer space. The challenges are both internal and external. I will quickly just run through this. Internally, there are so many concerns at the national level and at the regional level. Many African countries do not even have their own space program, and many of them do not have capacity to even develop a concrete space policy and program in the immediate time. However, even those with significant space policy and programs have financial challenges, technical issues. Many of them still rely on external actors they purchase their satellite from either satellite data, or even many of these countries that have their own satellite purchase this satellite from UK, from China, and the rest of them. So this is a major issue. Meanwhile, there are countries like South Africa that have displayed capacity to produce some of these satellite purchases outside the country. So Pan-Africanism is a major subject of concern when it comes to purchase, where we purchase our assets as major space player on the continent. Nigeria has purchased from UK and from China. Egypt have similar pattern of procurement. Algeria, Morocco have collaboration with France and the rest of them. Meanwhile, we can look for Pan-Africanism dictates solidarity, unity. There are facility in South Africa with AIT, Assembly Integration and Testing Facility, and with capacity to produce some of these satellites. Some of their products might be few years in space. They may still have long way to go to catch up with some of these advanced countries. However, putting resources together will go a long way to actually encourage local and internal capacity of African countries to actually compete in future. Again, many African countries have one satellite, two satellites. These are satellites that barely produce significant information for them that are required. But just imagine that we have constellation of this satellite. Instead of launching several satellites into space, African countries can actually agree on a quota. South Africa, you have responsibility to launch 2 satellites. Nigeria, you have responsibility of launching 2 satellites. If we have 10 African countries with responsibility to launch 2 satellites, that will be 20 satellites. A constellation of 20 satellites will be more productive and more scientifically enriching, will provide more security data as well as economically relevant data for the continent than each country launching, or all these countries launching one satellite that does not provide any substantive economic value for this country. So Pan-Africanism has internal issue, but in outer space, in its application in outer space, but Africa can still achieve a lot by coming together, working together on this issue of unity and solidarity in outer space. At the external dimension, however, which is a major concern, the geopolitics is a major concern that cannot be ignored. We have countries that have established their space infrastructure over the years that will not allow countries to easily develop capability to especially launch capability because of the dual usage of rocket and missile, as we can see with the experience of Iran, North Korea, and the rest of them. These are technology that can be easily converted for military use. Many of these countries will like to pressurize and sanction this country to discourage them from pursuing this kind of technology. However, coming together as a continent, we actually help Africa to push, to actually push a case for this. As a continent, it is easier to establish a regional control and a regional regime that is more trustworthy by outsiders than individual country pursuing a launch capability. So these are issues of concern, and geopolitics, we can see the growing complexity in international relations recently, the rise of emerging powers like Turkey and UAE and the rest of them in Africa, as well as the interest of China, Japan, South Korea in Africa. All these are very important when we are discussing the geopolitics of outer space in Africa. I will wait for the comment and question and section on this. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Samuel. Yes, there are comments indeed, and perhaps quite many. So, but I wish we had all the time, but we don't. Thank you so much, Samuel, for that very big summary of how Pan-Africanism expresses itself in Africa. I've never really thought much about the social, cultural, and education aspects. It's always about the big documents, like from the AUC, like you said. And thank you. So we're just going to go to the second part of the discussion where we're going to narrow down more into space and talk about regional integration in space in Africa. And for this conversation, I'm going to start with Maximilien. If you want to present and start your presentation. Thank you. Please, if you have any questions and you don't want to forget, feel free to put the questions in the chat. Sorry about that. I'll be very happy to take your questions. Thank you.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you so much, Nelly, for inviting me to this talk. And it's my great pleasure to be on the panel. I'd like to share my screen and
yeah, you should be able to.
hopefully it's visible.
Okay. Yes.
Okay, perfect.
Yes, it is.
Great.
Thank you.
Okay. And right, so thank you again for inviting me. And I'd like to expand a little bit on the discussion already kind of laid by Shadrach and also Samuel. And I'll try to expand more in the space direction in my talk. So I'll be focusing not only on regional space cooperation in Africa, but I'd like to talk a little bit about other frameworks for space cooperation around the world and hopefully draw some lessons from those efforts that could potentially be applied in Africa as well. So specifically, I'd like to talk about three main topics in this presentation, starting with motivations for regional space cooperation. So in the first place, why do we want to cooperate in space on a regional level? Secondly, I'd like to talk about some recent regional space agencies. So Samuel already mentioned about the African Space Agency, but there are also other recent examples in Latin America and also in the Middle East. And finally, I'd like to talk a bit about regions where there are no regional space agencies, yet where there are quite active regional cooperation activities. So one example is Asia. So how do I want to do this? So I'd like to pick up a few examples and case studies in each of these regions due to time limitations. And as I mentioned, I'd like to draw some parallels with space in Africa. And so Samuel already mentioned about some of the basic values and guiding principles that are involved in Pan-Africanism in space, such as brotherhood, solidarity, unity, and agency. And we will see that these have also guided regional space efforts in other places around the world. And Samuel also talked about economic, social, cultural, and foreign policy motivations or guiding forces behind space activities. And we will see that in other regions, these are also at play as well. So first of all, why do we want to collaborate as regions in space in the first place? So before answering this question, I'd like to provide two examples. So this is the first example, which illustrates government space budgets around the world. And we can draw kind of three main observations from this infographic. First of all, we can see that a few countries dominate global spending on space activities. So United States in particular, and also China. So that's the first observation. Second observation is that for countries which are not United States or China, it's very difficult to compete with these very large budgets. So this suggests that by pooling financial resources as a region or among other countries on sub-regional level, this is quite an effective way to grow available resources and to more meaningfully enter the global space sector. And third point is that for relatively new entrants to the space field, not only is spending relatively small, but the domestic space market can also be quite small. So in order for domestic companies to expand their market and to be able to offer their services or products to more clients, it can be quite effective as well to collaborate with other countries, including on a regional level, to grow the available market for space products and services. So these are three kind of lessons and motivations we understand already about regional space sector collaboration. Second point is about common challenges that are faced on a regional level that can be tackled using space data especially, and also space infrastructure in general. So here are some examples. So for example, global warming, deforestation, wildfires, air pollution, these are all typically issues that are not confined by national borders, but typically extend over a regional level. So it makes sense when we're developing space applications or products or services to develop them with a regional lens in mind. So thinking about how they will be deployed to tackle common issues at the same time in multiple countries, rather than limiting applications to a single country, in order to amplify impact and potentially to pool resources for these types of projects. So those were two examples that I touched upon. So why do we want to cooperate in space? So as I mentioned, one example is to pool financial resources. Another one is to address challenges in a unified way. But there are also other motivations. So for example, in terms of foreign policy, so it makes sense to cooperate on a regional level in order to promote common interests when interfacing with external partners. So that's another motivation. Another is to gain autonomy in space technology development. So Samuel mentioned that many satellites that are used in African countries have been purchased from overseas. So in order to gain more capacity to develop satellites internally, it makes sense to pool resources and to collectively grow capacity for that purpose. Samuel also mentioned about education as one important driving force for space activities, and that's a very good point. So this is another area where regional collaboration can be used to grow knowledge in all space disciplines, not limited to technology, but also policy, to develop a more robust regional space ecosystem. And another point is development of national niches. So if countries on a regional level are collaborating to develop space projects, then there's some scope for each country to develop its own expertise that can be continuously leveraged to contribute to larger regional space initiatives. So regional collaboration enables the development of these types of niches. So a country doesn't have to solve the entire picture by themselves, but they can develop quite a deep niche in one specific area that enables them to gain competitiveness globally while also contributing to regional space projects. So that's some of the kind of key points I want to raise for this first section about motivations for regional space cooperation. And probably in the audience, you are also thinking of other ideas of why to promote space cooperation. So I'd be curious to know your perspectives on this topic as well. So now we understand why we want to cooperate on a regional level in the space sector. So that's very nice, but in terms of how to do it in reality, clearly there may be some challenges. So one method we can use to cooperate on a regional level is to develop regional space agencies. So we've already heard about African Space Agency, which is shown here, which is headquartered in New Cairo in Egypt. But I'd like to talk about two other recent regional space agencies, which are the Latin American and Caribbean Space Agency, which is headquartered in Mexico, and the Arab Space Cooperation Group, which is headquartered in Abu Dhabi in United Arab Emirates. So here's a little bit more data about these different regional space agencies. So I'm sure that many of you already know about African Space Agency, or AFSA. So it was established in 2018, but only recently operationalized. It has a few supporting instruments that have already been mentioned. It's mostly funded by African Union, and it's an intergovernmental organization. So ALSA in Latin America and Caribbean is quite similar. So it's an intergovernmental organization as well, but it only has 21 members, so a little bit smaller. And it's not part of a continental level framework like African Union. It's a kind of independent organization. So as a result, not all countries in the region are members. So for example, Brazil, which is one of the biggest kind of space countries in Latin America, is not part of this group, which is one challenge that is currently being faced by ALSA. On the other hand, we have other methods for regional cooperation. So Arab Space Cooperation Group is one example. So in this case, it's not an intergovernmental organization. It's a regional cooperation group. So it's a little bit looser. It doesn't have as much integration, but it still has some supporting instruments. So a basic charter, and it has 14 member states. So one kind of tool we can use to gain insights into what are the driving forces behind these organizations is statements of purpose. So in the different kind of documents that have been published defining these organizations. So in terms of AFSA, something that we've already kind of heard in previous presentations is this idea of space being used for sustainable development and for the improvement of quality of life across the African continent. So this is one of the main driving forces behind the African Space Agency. In ALSA, we have a slightly different focus. So there's a greater focus on technology development, which illustrates the priorities in that region. And for the Arab Space Cooperation Group, there's a focus on shared identity, so bonding between Arab nations and the sense of brotherhood between peoples of the Arab countries. So these illustrate different priorities or different kind of driving forces that are at play behind different regional space agencies. In terms of common features, so based on a study I did recently, these are some of the common features I identified between these regional space agencies. And due to time constraints, I want to focus on kind of one of these, which is the idea of joint technology development. So this comes back to a point made by Samuel in his presentation that in order to develop regional capacity to actually make satellites, it makes sense to cooperate between countries. And so by developing satellites, it's not only about kind of producing some object, it's not only about making a satellite, but it's the entire process behind that. So in order to launch a satellite, proficiency in space law and regulation is also required. So by developing a satellite, participants will automatically gain exposure to those kind of considerations as well. The process of developing a satellite may also kind of create new technologies that can be spun off into other industries or companies. So there's the opportunity for entrepreneurship. Students can also benefit from joining these types of projects. So it's a great way to combine academia and industry, maybe also government. So that's why these regional space agencies have focused on satellite development as one method to progressively grow their capacity in multiple areas, not limited to technology. So here are three examples in African Space Agency, ASCG, and ALSA. So one example in Africa is the Africa Development Satellite Project, or AFDEVSAT. So it's led by Egypt as part of its mandate of hosting the African Space Agency. The objective is to develop a satellite with multiple countries in the region contributing different subsystems of this satellite. And in parallel, many engineers and young professionals from beyond participating countries are also receiving training as part of the project. So this is one kind of flagship initiative that's being led by Egypt, but in the context of AFSA. In terms of the Middle East, one example is the Arab Satellite 813. So this is being led by United Arab Emirates, and member states of ASCG are contributing. So the objective is to develop a multi-purpose remote sensing satellite. However, one limitation perhaps of this project is that United Arab Emirates is leading very much most of the activities. So it's providing the funding, it's in charge of development. So some engineers from other countries are also participating, but based on available information, it seems to be mostly developed inside the UAE. So there's some room for discussion over how much other participating countries will actually benefit in terms of capacity development. And finally, in Latin America and the Caribbean, there's a project to develop a nanosatellite constellation. So as Samuel mentioned, it makes sense to consider developing multiple satellites on a regional level so that each country can kind of have first-hand experience. And so this seems to be the approach adopted in this regional space agency. So Mexico is leading this project, and the objective is to develop a constellation that can be used for disaster management. So again, these projects illustrate that satellite initiatives, even if they're small satellites, even if the performance initially is quite limited, can provide a convenient method to grow capacity in multiple space areas. So we've seen in part 2 that regional space agencies are one option, but they're not the only option for regional cooperation. So Asia is an interesting example because there's no regional space agency, and yet there are many activities for regional cooperation. So I'll talk a little bit about what makes Asia unique in that regard. So as I just mentioned, there's no regional space agency, but regional space efforts can be characterized by 3 words. So overlapping, partial, and varied. So let me explain what I mean by that in the next 2 slides. So first of all, there are many different frameworks for space sector cooperation in Asia. So these are some examples. So you can see some, so specifically Southeast Asia. So there are some that are specifically under this kind of intergovernmental framework called ASEAN. There are also regional fora, there are UN affiliated organizations, there are global organizations, and there are specific groups focusing on industry. And when we look at how the extent to which different countries in the region are participating in these frameworks, we can see that coverage is quite non-uniform. So some countries are very active, some are not very active, some choose to participate in some frameworks more than others. And we can see that countries like China, Japan, and Thailand in particular are leading efforts for regional cooperation. And by analyzing kind of the effectiveness of these frameworks, we understand that there's cooperation in certain areas, but not in others. So for example, for data sharing and small-scale capacity building, there's lots of cooperation. But in other areas like longer-term capacity building, entrepreneurship, policymaking, and funding, it seems to be quite difficult to collaborate in depth. So this suggests that, especially for these areas, this is where some kind of external stimulus may be quite valuable to grow cooperation. So finally, I'd like to close by talking about an academic project. So we've seen that governments can lead regional space cooperation efforts, but I'd like to make the case that there's also a room for academic actors to play a kind of greater role in leading regional space collaboration efforts. So this is something that Samuel also talked about, this idea of in Africa, students can gain experience in different countries and thereby kind of expand their skill sets. So I'm going to wrap this up very quickly, Nelly. And so this is one example in Japan where the Kyushu Institute of Technology, a university, is training space engineers in the entire process of satellite development. So they can get involved in every aspect of this process from design all the way to operations. And after returning to their home countries, these students then go on to develop their own education programs. Some students have developed companies, have gone on to play roles in government. So starting from Japan, led by university, there's now a quite effective global network of, including in Asia in particular, of universities that are continuing to develop these types of projects, even without kind of going through government. So that's all I really want to say. So rather than providing conclusions, I'd like to kind of provide questions. So I think there are still many things that could be discussed. So we've talked about regional level, but obviously there's some balance between the region and also national and global level. So finding this balance is quite important when we talk about regional collaboration in space. One thing another important point is the room for non-governmental initiatives. So we talked about governments, but we also saw that universities, industry, and civil society, for example, the Space Hubs Africa is one good example as well. They can also play very important roles in regional space cooperation. So I think that exploring these types of questions in more detail would help us to find solutions for more effective regional cooperation. So that's all. So thank you very much. And maybe later in Q&A, we can elaborate on some of these topics. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Max, and just tuning out and letting us see like the bigger picture of what's happening in other regions as well. Because sometimes our own little bubble tend to think that okay, what we're doing is so special, but at the end of the day, when it comes to like global space politics, there are these features that really tease out similarly, and it's really good to see them in terms of the data. Very, very well informed slide. Thank you so much. And I just want to call on Arnold if he's ready. And Arnold will be giving us from a legal perspective on how regional cooperation in space could maybe position Africa for international space law. Thank you, Arnold.
Thank you very much, Nelly, and thank you to all the three speakers before me who have covered almost everything I should be talking about, which means that much of what I will speak about is going to be focused on law, policy, regulation, but also is going to intertwine with what was already mentioned. So all three speakers have correctly mentioned that it's important for us to think about regional cooperation when we are trying to build space programs, especially in continents or countries which are not as developed on the technical side, or which don't have as much funding that would support, the growth, that organic growth of the space industry in different countries. Now, what those three speakers have focused on is some of those practical elements, but there are those elements which are not exactly can I say practical, in the sense that they are there, they affect the way space programs operate, the way space programs grow, and they determine whether a space program will be successful or if it will fail. And one of those is law, policy, and governance frameworks. So Mr. Berthet has correctly mentioned that, across the globe, there are different forms and different mechanisms for conducting regional operations. And underlying those are also different forms and mechanisms of regulating or governing those regional cooperation mechanisms. And in Africa, one of the biggest challenges is that the regulation, the governance framework is fragmented. And this is a problem because it affects how investment is done. It affects who gets to get involved in the continent, because some entities that are very well versed with technology, that are very developed, that can easily build a space program, would perhaps not be inclined to move into the continent because of the nature of the regulation. Mr. Kundi mentioned that there is a need to develop launching capability, for instance. And there are certain places in Africa which are naturally capable of hosting launching. You would need very little in terms of technological drive, to have those places successfully become launching sites. Think about Somalia. Think about the coast of Kenya. Natural. But the regulation, the construct around them, the governance systems, both internally but also on the space side, do not allow for investment in that area. So we need to revisit the concept of Pan-Africanism. Why do we need to revisit it? Because Pan-Africanism is entirely dynamic. It's supposed to be dynamic. It's not supposed to be, static. What's the relation between law, Pan-Africanism, and this space? Let me just highlight this. When I think it was Mr. Kundi and Mr. Oyewole, when they described Pan-Africanism, we described it from an economic perspective, from a political perspective, unite Africa, let Africa move together, let Africa build, let Africa find its capacity within itself to build some of these programs. But when Pan-Africanism was developing, it wasn't limited to that. It was also limited to analyzing what types of laws and superstructures cause the lack of development of Africa and Africans. Okay? So when we speak about Pan-Africanism in the space sector, we should interest ourselves in speaking about how the current laws are either supporting the concept of Pan-Africanism or defeating the concept of Pan-Africanism. Okay? We build a little bit on this. There's a hybridity within Pan-Africanism. Of course, there are race relations, there are geographical aspects of geographical alignment, there are even temporal constructions when we talk about Pan-Africanism. But the supporting system for all those things is law, governance, and institutional frameworks. Okay? Think about apartheid South Africa. There was a race relation. There was a certain position that Africans were not equated or equal to the white African race in South Africa. Okay? Now, what underpinned that belief was law. So when on the criminal books, you would have actual law saying you cannot maybe intermarry, and those laws would be enforced within the courts of South Africa. Okay? Now, for our benefit, for the Pan-African program, we need to be able to do the same thing in a positive way. We need to be able to have laws on the book that ensure that Pan-Africanism should be supported, And when they come to the courts of law in Africa, they are enforced. All I'm trying to say is, if apartheid South Africa was successful because of the laws and institutions, then a space program in Africa can be successful because of the laws and institutions. Okay? Our job is to build those laws and institutions. Now, when you look at the African continent, the way we define Pan-Africanism is maybe three broad ways. Number one, it is to act in the interest of Africa. So think about which laws enforce or ensure that African countries are acting in the interest of Africa. Okay? So when we are trading, for instance, in the space sector, do we have laws that bind the African countries to not think about individual nations, but think about the continent? Do we have them? Two, acting in solidarity. Okay, we have a whole continent, a continental body, which ideally, by the way, in the Pan-African program, is supposed to be leading the interactions of Africa with other continents or with other, partners outside Africa. But do we have a system that binds the African nations, okay, to do that? Perhaps not. Perhaps it's there, but perhaps it's not as strong enough. And then the third thing is acting in full self-determination. Okay, and this one is important because I think it was Mr. Oyewole who mentioned that there is, no, actually it was Mr. Kundi who mentioned that there was neo-colonialism. Okay, there are influences from outside that determine what African nations do. Do we have a system, a set of rules, a set of regulations, an infrastructure system that helps us sieve through what is truly African and what is external to Africa? So these are the three things we need to build, and you can only build them based on law, policy, and regulation. Now, before Nelly turns on her camera and reminds me that I have talked too much, I will say that there maybe I will point out maybe three limitations, broad limitations that are affecting us. Okay, we do have an African space program. We do have an infrastructure for Africa. Mr. Berthet has excellently defined it and projected it to everyone. So you know that there's an African Space Agency, and its role and its goal and its ambitions have been stated. But between the African Space Agency and the national space agencies, based on the African program, there is supposed to be sub-regional space agencies. You see, the African program and the Pan-African program was actually designed not for the continental level, but sub-regional levels were supposed to form up and join at a continental level. So the original design is for an East African framework, working with a Southern African framework, working with a Northern African framework, and a Central African framework. This is why Africa was divided into those 5 sub-regional bodies. Okay? And so these sub-regional entities are supposed to be the building blocks for the African program. So when we talk about an African Space Agency, we should be naturally seeing some form of sub-regional cooperation. It doesn't have to be a space agency. It doesn't have to be, it could be just a block of national space agencies, at a sub-regional level. Why? Because it is within those sub-regions that you can merge the law. It is easier to merge the law in Eastern Africa than to do it on a continental level. There are different interests. There are different frameworks. But if you merge the law in Eastern Africa, in Southern Africa, which are more close with nations which are more closely related in terms of geography, closely related in terms of realities, you might be able to have a more formal, straightforward conversation at a continental level. Africa is 55 countries. 55 countries. Different from the Arab Space Cooperation Group, which is, I think, 14. Different from the, and I see Nelly now, different from the Latin American, which is about 20-something, Mr. Berthet, you'll correct me, 20-something, 55 nations. How do you bring those 55 nations thinking together, acting in the interest of Africa? 2, acting in solidarity. 3, acting in full self-determination. So the missing links are the following. 1, there is that sub-regional missing link. 2, a funding scheme and a sharing scheme. So it's more difficult to have it at a continental level because now you're dealing with 55 countries. I'm not saying it's impossible. It's just more difficult. But you might be able to have it at a sub-regional level because you can always reproduce what has already been done at a sub-regional level. These sharing schemes are there. Taxes are being shared amongst regional countries. So it's possible for us to build on that to get an African space program. And lastly, and most importantly, the fragmentation of regulations. At the African continental level, the law is designed to be fragmented because there are 55 countries. You can't, but at the sub-regional level, you have certain movements already that have started to merge regulation, that have started to harmonize law. And that's what you need to build a proper space program. My last and very last, Nelly,
Of course,
is
Arnold.
to point out that we have to think about the diaspora. We really have to think about the diaspora. You know, Pan-Africanism, correctly defined by Mr. Kundi, was not just about the Africans on the African continent. It was also about the Africans in the diaspora. Correct, Mr. Kundi? It was also about the Africans in the diaspora. And one of the biggest resources that has been taken away from Africa for years is its people. Okay, when we talk about slavery, it wasn't just about taking people and enslaving them. It was removing that labor force from Africa, which then defeats the ability for Africa to build upon its resources, to build upon its knowledge. Because when you remove that labor force and donate it to another area, then you take away the ability for that knowledge to grow within the continent. Now, while we have, and Mr. Berthet had a slide at the end of universities, universities that are supporting the growth of, space activities on the continent, and I agree with that analysis, and even with the approach of using educational bodies to build, capacity. However, we need entities on the continent, okay, that are like space hubs that are able to bring back that academic and a professional body of Africans in the diaspora. Okay, because these are the ones that are actually going to build the programs. Not because the ones on the continent don't know what is being done. No, don't get me wrong. No. But because they have acquired a training that is global. Okay, and that training is very important to mix with the training of those who have it on the continent, the training of those who have, let me call it an indigenous training on the continent. So it's important for us to focus on this academic, the return of academia, and to build programs that support the return of that academia, like Space Hubs is doing, like many other African entities are doing, or people in African universities are doing. Thank you very much for this opportunity, Nelly, and I'm glad to be a part of this. Happy to hear from the rest of the audience if you have any questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Arnold, for that very interesting conversation that calls for deep reflection on law and institutions. It's one thing, like some we talk about aspirate, but then do we have the institutional frameworks to actually support some of these dreams? And law is one of that institutional framework that would change it from aspiration to reality. So it's really good to go back to that. And yes, we don't have a lot of time for interaction, but we still have time. We still have some time to discuss and have a panel discussion. So if you have a question from the whole presentation, I see that a lot of people that started out at the beginning of the call are still here. Thank you so much. And please feel free to raise your hand or drop your question on the chat, and I'll be very, very happy to have you ask your question. So I'm just going to start from my end. And I'll just go back to Shadrach. Thanks for the foundation, for laying the foundation. And just picking up from where Arnold left when he talked about fragmented systems, you had talked about the Western states not being very state-centric models of governance not being favorable for seeing divisions of Pan-Africanism, and hence may affect, space projects as well. And I wanted to see maybe your opinion and thoughts on what model you think would work, seeing how far we've come from the 60s. It might be hard to reverse things, but just your general opinion on that. And then secondly, you also talked about how Pan-Africanism is been disconnected from the African people. Like if I talk to maybe like an everyday person somewhere in Eastern Nigeria, in a suburb, they just know that they're like maybe their tribe or their community. And what do you see about Pan-Africanism and Africans all working together being like an elitist idea for us that like know all the 55 states, that know all this stuff about history? Because at the end of the day, it's not also about political unity, it's also about this underground, consciousness of Africans working together. So how do we demystify Pan-Africanism in that regard? Shadrach. Sorry, it's a long question.
Yeah. So in demystifying Pan-Africanism, it's about creating a model towards ensuring that all people of African descent understand our past and try to reconnect our past into explaining why we are at this juncture of our lives as Africans. That's trying to explain the present and where we want to be in the future. So it's a reconnection between the past, the present, and the future.
Mm.
And it all comes, or it boils down to the issue of consciousness, and consciousness comes out of education. And these educational frameworks are not tilted towards trickling down the information of Pan-Africanism to the grassroots. And in my maxim, I'm saying that Pan-Africanism in itself is not static. When you look at the writings of someone like Barker, it says that Pan-Africanism is beyond moderatism to partism, implying that the failure of our state systems will create a remodeling of Pan-Africanism and trying to make an organic way, or trying to reformulate an organic system that creates a new form of consciousness.
Mm.
And it's all back on the structural challenges that we are facing as Africans. Yes, Africans have all the resources to develop. As the last speaker was speaking about how those strategic spaces is what is better enough for space exploration, yet we are not using it as a result of the laws and the structures put in place. These will be the foundational grounds towards bringing about a new form of consciousness, interlinked with the consciousness of Pan-Africanism laid down by the forefathers of African youth. So the maxim that seeks to play out under circumstances where the needs of the people are not met, and also there are deficits in terms of meeting their aspiration, are the elitists who are on top of the table, who are implementing the Pan-African system of governance, towards inculcating us into the future. So There are questions about why Africans do have most of the resources, yet we are poor. There are questions about how we are not using our agency optimally. And these are the questions that the people ask. They are asking the questions as to why are we highly indebted, yet our problems are not solved. They are asking the questions, why do we have a lot of sunshine, yet we do not have access to electricity? Why do we have enough land, arable land, yet we do not have food on the table? These are the questions that the ground people or the grassroots will ask, and it will bring a form of what? A new kind of revolution. And if the system does not balance it, such revolution will still come with questions, as we always see.
Yeah. Yeah, interesting perspectives. Thanks for speaking for the ground people right now, because yeah, these issues might seem academic, but those questions that you raised are they are very true, and these are the issues. Thank you so much, Shadrach. And I'm just going to pick up from what Arnold said and ask Samuel about that, and it's about the fragmentation, the fragmentation of national laws, of course, which is based on national priority and strategy. So since we have African countries, due to how the space sector is, I think you've written a paper on national security issues. Can you talk about that? Because, for example, Nigeria and South Africa are not the best of friends diplomatically. Itim is on the call, and he has written a paper about how a policy brief on how they should possibly work together. If we really don't want to work together, all these fancy things we write in the AUC policy documents, they'll just remain fancy. So could you just talk about why we're having, that issue?
Okay, thank you so much for that question. I think the fragmentation of Africa cannot be underestimated, because bringing 54 countries together to agree on a single thing is not going to be easy. And again, I will recall that if we look at different African countries, 54 African countries, they are different stages of development in space policy and programs. So the aspiration of this country varies based on their capacity and development in space program. Why countries like Nigeria, Egypt, South Africa have decades, not less than 2 decades of experience in space sector. There are countries that only have a few years, like 2-3 years of launching their first satellite. So the aspiration differs across that 54 countries line and division. So expecting that all these countries will be speaking with the same voice, we agree on certain things, may not be that easy. Some country, their aspiration at this level is still how to purchase the smallest satellite possible that can last for just 1 or 2 weeks in space, and they will be also recorded as a spacefaring country on the continent. So the interest vary. However, there are countries on the continent that they have surpassed that stage of having one small satellite that will last for 1 week or 2 weeks. They need something that will be in space for 10 years, 20 years to conduct advanced, to gather advanced data for reconnaissance and for military purposes. Started with South Africa, which actually orbited the first military satellite in Africa in 2014. So many African countries are sponsoring military satellites in the recent years. We have seen the case of Nigeria in 2023, Algeria, Morocco have sponsored 2 dual-use satellites for military purposes. And some of these countries have started establishing institutions for these purposes. So if we look at this, these countries don't have, all these African countries don't have the same agenda or the same immediate interest. And for me, arriving at Pan-Africanism does not necessarily have to be linear. We have to be open-minded and consider multiple ways to achieve this objective. And one of the ways that we can also explore as a continent is, I'm sorry to say, power politics. Because countries have different desire and agenda, there are some countries, leading African countries have to come together and agree. Then factor in the interest of upcoming African countries in space. Then it is by this way that we can have the same agenda, the same interest, the same desire. Countries that just want one small satellite sitting at the same table with a country that is looking out for military satellite. Yeah, the interest is different. But when a country that needs a small satellite is sitting at the same table with country that need military satellite, but in that country is aware that that big country beside his neighboring country can actually support their university, just like what Japan has done for many African countries. By bring your student, come and learn, support them with little funding. Then you can produce that mini satellite. We can support you to launch that mini satellite. You provide common ground for negotiation. So the big African countries have more responsibility to play here. There's no way a country like Mauritius, Seychelles, Cabo de Verde, and the rest of them, they have interest in space, but not the same interest that countries like Nigeria, South Africa, Algeria, Egypt have in space. So there's a need for these big African countries to lead. The presentation by, I'm sorry, I'm not sure whether I'm pronouncing your name now, Mazi, actually shows how these some of these issues play out in other parts of the world, whereby a country lead on certain project, another country lead on another project. In terms of law, we can agree on regulation. In terms of certain policy, we can agree. But in terms of project, because someone has to pay for the project, and you will not expect, why is it that the first initiative, space initiative in Zambia failed in 1960? The request of the head of that space agency in 1960 surpassed the GDP of that country.
I thought that was a huge, I thought it was a huge, like a joke or something.
It was converted to a joke. It was a reality. It was converted to a joke because many observers believe that that can just only be a joke. So that's the reason why, because financing is involved, funding is involved, institutional capacity is involved, technological lead or technological development is involved. It means that this big country has to play a major role, carry all African countries along. We have to work together, but the big countries have to play a leading role. Thank you.
Wow, thank you. I think Arnold raised his hand when you were speaking. I presume it's to respond to something he said. Please, Arnold, go ahead, and then I'll take the questions.
Yeah, maybe to respond, hopefully not to quarrel, but to say that we need to be, in my opinion, we need to be careful. We need to be very careful when we talk about building equality on a continent. Okay? So there are realities of having countries with bigger space programs, and those are leading in technology, those have capacity, and naturally they will probably lead the process of developing an African space economy. Naturally, they will. However, we are not talking simply about the ability to build a satellite and launch it or pay for it. We are talking about obtaining the goals of Africa through space. Space is not an end in itself. It's the products and the services that come from space that are important. Going to space or launching a satellite is not for the glory, simply for the glory of the country or glory of the continent. It's for an ability to put something in space that develops the continental programs, that is assist us to achieve the continental aims. So small countries like South Sudan, okay, which are not capable at the moment, are even more important, because those are the countries that you rely on at a global level, okay, to vote in favor of Africa. So if I were a big spacefaring nation in Africa, I would pamper the less developed spacefaring nations of Africa. Because in global diplomacy, you need countries. It's a question of numbers. It's not a question of how developed are you per se. No, that's not the only question of how developed are you in the space industry. It's also there is an aspect of numbers. So we need to be strategic, very careful
Yeah.
when we are talking about who matters on the continent and how should they matter and who should have the say. Okay. Lastly, when you look at the African program, well, the Pan-African program and the program to develop Africa, right from the time when we were agitating for independence, equality of the nations of Africa was a common theme, a common line. You cannot have equality if you have a domination of a group of countries, okay, on the basis of their development. That group of countries should, correctly as Mr. Oyewole says, should help the rest of the African countries achieve a certain level of development so that you have critical mass on the continent and you have, all these programs well developed. But you should always maintain the concept of equality. So small countries like Cape Verde, I mean, you talk about a country like Somalia, may not have the budget to develop a space program at the moment, but by God, it has the environment to host it, right? So there's always something to bring on the continent of Africa. It may not be money, it may be the natural resources required. Okay, it may not be the money, it may be the local technology. Africans have been interacting with space for centuries through astronomy. So that knowledge is there, it is seated there. We only need to extract it and we only need to build on it. That's all I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Arnold. I think before I call on Max and then we'll take the questions, it just ties back to what Kundi said about, when we adopted Western systems of government with sovereignty and power play and all these things, with the borders, we then have all these issues of geopolitics and national interest and big boys and small boys. So the idea of equality, then there's now this tension between, our solidarity and all the national interest. And I think thanks for just, sharing your points on that. And maybe Max wants to respond to that as well.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I'll try to be as brief as possible and answer some of the questions in the chat at the same time.
Yeah, great.
So first, I'd like to kind of, respond to something that was mentioned by Mr. Oyewole and also Mr. Agaba regarding the endpoint of space development in different countries in Africa. I think Pan-Africanism doesn't mean that each country will have the same endpoints during their space development activities. Maybe they will be aiming for something quite different. Maybe for one country, it will be about developing military satellites, as was mentioned. For another, maybe it will just be about using the data obtained by satellites from other countries. So I think that's something important when having this type of discussion. Maybe there will be some shared goals on a regional level, but maybe within each country, there will be very different endpoints for space development. So that's one thing. And then regarding knowledge gaps, so something that was a question in the chat, how to bridge these knowledge gaps. I think one that is especially challenging is knowledge gaps in terms of developing hardware for space. So developing satellites or the infrastructure for ground stations, etc. I think there's only so much that can be learned from textbooks, and there is really a need to get hands-on with these types of projects. And this is something that can really only be done through collaboration with other countries that have more advanced experience. So Egypt and South Africa have been mentioned multiple times already. So I think those are good partners for developing this capacity. So I think that comes back to something that Mr. Oyewole mentioned earlier, the importance of transferring human resources between countries within Africa to provide those knowledge transfers. So some things can be done online, but I think for space technology development, there really is a need to experience hands-on that process. So I think moving people physically between countries in the region will be a critical part of that. So those are just 2 points I wanted to add in response to the discussion. Thank you.
Yeah, interesting point. Thank you so much, Max. And thanks for answering the question on the chat already. So I think we have 3 more questions on the chat, and I'll quickly go through them. And I'll start with Timothy. Timothy's asking, I think this may be for Samuel, how the AU level space policy can be structured. Okay, it's for Arnold, rather. Okay. At the AU level, space policy can be structured to ensure a number of smaller or less developed member states are not left behind in the Pan-African agenda, and how can the agenda be considered, seeing they may not have massive contributions. This is quite interesting because it's just spin-offs from the conversations that what you and Samuel were just talking about. So Arnold, if you just want to go back to that, and I'll just read out for Tando. I think Tando's question, if you could take it, Max. Tando's asking, where does geopolitics come in? Can African countries cooperate based on Pan-African values? Well, they have different geopolitical leanings. Example, Congo has just signed off its mineral in return for security from the US, while the Sahel is leaning towards Russia. And then so Max, you can answer that, or Samuel, you want whoever feels very comfortable, because he didn't state who to answer. And then the last question is for you, Max. Okay, great. So Max, maybe you can take the last question, and then Samuel, you could take the question from Tando, I think evenly distributed. So Arman is asking, it's a long question. Let me go to the question itself. How will African countries be able to utilize outer space, as in reality, there is a lack of infrastructure and scientific knowledge? Only African countries from Africa are able to harness space exploration. How about other countries? What about national space policies, as only few have been formulated? So let's take the first question for Arnold, and then we'll take Tando's from Samuel, and then we'll take this last question.
Okay, thank you very much. It's a very good question, and I agree with you. It links with what we've already been talking about. Maybe I'll just use the opportunity to point out that we should not really look at the space policy or the space program for Africa in isolation of the rest of the programs. That policy, that program is linked to every other program on the continent. But it's also linked to every other institutional or legal framework on the continent. I'll give you an example. When we talk about the benefits going to not just the big space-faring African nations, you then need to create or develop a benefit scheme. A scheme that says, if you contribute a certain level of amount of money or certain level of technology or expertise, you too will benefit, your country too will benefit. And whilst we don't have one very well developed example on the African continent, we do have several at a regional level that have been working very well. I just gave an example of the different tax bodies in the regions that collect taxes and in the common markets, and have a scheme of sharing them. In East Africa, for instance, you have a joint visa, for people who want to visit different countries in East Africa. You can apply for one visa. That's, I think, for Kenya, Rwanda, Uganda. Now, there's a benefit scheme. There's a way they share the resources. This is just money, but it's an example. There's a way they share those resources among the countries that are participating. So it's possible for us to develop a benefit scheme on the continent. We should also look to other places, like in Europe. Okay, European Space Agency has a very well-developed benefit scheme, very well-developed contribution and benefit scheme. So it's only for us to observe, take lessons, and apply those lessons in Africa. I promise you it is not plagiarism. I promise you it is not illegal. Okay, Africa has contributed knowledge. We can also benefit from the knowledge or the developed processes that have been contributed by others on a global level. Secondly, technology transfer scheme. This is very important because it's linked to commerce. It's linked to commerce. When you break down a space program, at the end of it, it's technology. At the end of it, it's technology. It's the ability to develop a system, hardware, software. That's all you're talking about. So you need a scheme in Africa that supports that transfer of tech. Well, first of all, the development of technology, but also the transfer of technology within the continent. So the intellectual property that goes into developing space programs. You know, there are Africans that have built satellites. Those Africans should be able to benefit, first of all, themselves, but also the nations that they come from, based off of the knowledge. Let me give you an example. If I studied in Uganda from primary to secondary and left maybe at university level and went to the United States, and in the United States, I built a satellite, right? Uganda has contributed to the building of that satellite because my primary knowledge was in Uganda. So there must be a way Uganda should benefit from me, first of all, because it invested in me. It gave me primary education, it gave me high school education. There must be ways we should be able to derive benefit from those individuals who are working in the diaspora. And this goes back to my point of don't forget the Africans in the diaspora, the ones who are working in EASA, the ones who are working in NASA, the ones who are working in the Canadian Space Agency. They are there.
The thing is not us forgetting them, it's them actually forgetting Africa.
Oh, well,
This is a very long conversation that
yes, it is.
we
But
can have.
unfortunately, Nelly, here we've had a bit of these conversations between you and I. But I'll tell you one thing: the countries in Africa are responsible as well. Okay, the countries in Africa are responsible as well. If you look at Europe, if you look at Northern America, they don't let their people disappear in Africa. No. Those embassies, those consulates that are seated in the different countries where you are from in Africa are there to do certain pieces of work. So when they organize events on an annual basis and invite the different diaspora from the US, working in Uganda, from the US working in Kenya, they are doing it because they keep that link, they keep that connection. And before you know it, somehow there is a relation. There are benefits. I'll tell you a story and then I'll shut up. Yes, I think I can tell a story. It's not political in any way. You all know Idi Amin. So long story short, Idi Amin hosts Palestine an aircraft which is subdued by Palestine activists in Uganda. And that aircraft so happened to have nationals of Israel. Now, when Israel was planning on how to attack the airport in Uganda and free their nationals, it got the blueprints from an Israeli company that had been used to develop or build the airport. Simple. Does it click now?
Yes, it
it's not a question of simply, let's, the people are in the US, that what are they doing? How can we connect to them? Always keep in touch with them because you will need them. It may not be something big, it may just be the need for blueprint. Now, I'm not supporting the theft of blueprints across the space industry, don't get me wrong. All I'm saying is that there are patterns that have been developed by the global north that can be used by the global south in their process. We don't really need to redevelop the wheel. And to emphasize that above all, that everything that underpins all of this is laws, policies, strategies, and the frameworks that are in place to do this. We just need to be very, very intentional in doing it. So when we set up a body, it had better have the right system to achieve the process that we need to. The money will come. Thank you very much.
Really funny. Thank you so much, Arnold. Thank you so much. You've really captured everything. I'm not just going to, I have some comments, but maybe some other time. And Samuel, do you want to respond to Thando's very difficult question? I think he said people selling off, resources for security, something like that.
Okay, thank you for the questions, and those one at the comment section, I've picked a number of them. And then for the intervention from Dr. Agaba, I think I'm not sure whether I'm pronouncing the name very well. Okay, my apology if I'm not pronouncing it very well. Okay. So I agree with you on the issue of shared benefit is very important. Equality in terms of legal equality is very important on issue of Pan-Africanism in outer space. But we know how politics play out. And that's why I think I've been asked to discuss issue of geopolitics. Geopolitics mean one or few countries have to take the lead, engage with others, convince them on the shared benefit. And that's why it requires countries with resources to engage others. Equality, even in the most equal context, there's always inequality. However, the most important thing is shared benefit. Any arrangement of Pan-Africanism that we have to consider have to be based on shared benefit. What different, countries in different category of aspiration and development will benefit from the arrangement is the most important thing. Equal voting can apply, especially when it's political. And don't forget that I identify different dimensions of Pan-Africanism. On the economic dimension, it may not really be based on equality, because in my own thinking, or based on my own in my own assumption, the economic dimension of Pan-Africanism in outer space can actually involve few countries coming together to establish joint company, just like what we have in Europe. Although we have ESA, but there are so many companies in Europe that are just joint cooperation between Germany and France, between France and Italy, between Italy and Germany, and they are doing very well in space sector. So this model can be considered in Africa, whereby countries, a few countries come together. It does not have to be based on equal capacity. Rwanda and South Africa can contract to establish joint monitoring system, or one software to monitor, or AI company to decode satellite data and so on. So Africa needs to look beyond this traditional, and that's why I mentioned earlier that we need to go beyond linear approach to Pan-Africanism and open our mind to multiple dimensions. We have DMC, an agreement between Algeria, Kenya, South Africa, and Nigeria that was signed in 2003 to share satellite data for disaster management. We can revive such arrangement. We can have more of such arrangement. And again, in as much as I noticed another comment in the comment section on sub-regional organization. In as much as I am really in support of we considering sub-regional organization as a tool to advance Pan-Africanism, we can see what is happening in ECOWAS. A number of countries are pulling out now. So in such context now, and someone also raised issue of geopolitics. ECOWAS, the Sahel state, Mali, Burkina Faso, and then Niger have signed agreement with Russia to build 4 satellites for these countries. And that 4 satellites include a radar satellite, which is meant for military purpose. And immediately you can see, like a month after, Nigeria announced a plan to launch about 4 satellites too. A project between a local company, Proforce, and the military. So you can see this kind of geopolitics, we cannot ignore it, even at the regional level. And these are countries that we expect them to work together. So when you come to the eastern part of the continent, you see Ethiopia politics with neighboring countries, with Somalia, for instance, that almost destabilized the whole region. And the alliance between Somalia and Egypt as a follow-up response. So this geopolitics exists even within the continent, without talking about foreign power foreign influence of foreign power now. Within the continent, there are geopolitical dynamics. Nigeria and South Africa have its own history of rivalry and cooperation, but that does not stop us from coming together. The functional approach to cooperation can actually help out by establishing joint company that can work together to actually move the continent forward. And some of these things can be, we can trace some of these things from the history of European Union. started as a functional cooperation and then graduated, expanded to political dimension. Certain things we may not be able to agree upon in the immediate term. But if we start with functional cooperation, if we own satellite collectively, we have RASCOM, for instance. It was a regional organization in the continent that focused on satellite communication satellite with about 45 members. But the last satellite that was sponsored by RASCOM was mainly paid for by Libya and foreign players. But Libya was the main country that championed the project. So I'm not against the issue of equality, but certain countries have to play the role and convince other countries on the shared benefit of this arrangement. That was, I think that's the clarification I have to make around that. On the geopolitics, just to be quick about this, African countries have relied heavily on foreign powers. US for launch facility, Russia until recently for launch facility, and we have witnessed some countries considering India as well, and China as a major player in launching their satellites. Again, in purchase of satellite, we have seen UK, France playing major roles, in addition to China playing major roles in satellite design and produced by Africa. And the security implication of this is well known. It means you don't have total control over the data extracted from your satellite. And this is notable even in the case of military satellites built by South Africa. That was built by Russia. At a point, the South African insider within South African government were complaining about Russia taking too much control over the satellite. That's a military satellite. And that shows the need why Africa have to prioritize African in design and in the benefit. And again, just to support what Dr. Arnold mentioned earlier, on issue of country like South Sudan, country like Sudan, if there's Pan-African orientation towards satellite constellation, just like I mentioned earlier, there are so many African countries that are involved in armed conflict that need satellite data to support their armed forces. These are data that they cannot easily access from foreign satellite provider in many cases, because some of these countries do not even have the resources to access those data. But these are things that African countries can provide to support fellow African countries. If we have access to data that can support the military of neighboring country to address a major challenges, why not share such data? And Pan-Africanist spirit have to go, the issue of solidarity have to go beyond the development to the shared benefits. So, an issue of geopolitics at the external dimension, I think as we can see recently, Russia is carving out its own sphere of influence within the continent, increasingly expanding its influence in the continent. China have its own sphere of influence, although not at the recent time, most of these countries are not confrontational with a country that appears to be pro-West. But then we can see, especially with the development in Sahel, we may have something close to a space race in that region, if not well managed. So, and we have seen trends that, although it is a concept I don't like to, I don't appreciate the concept of space race because it's against the spirit of Africanism or Pan-Africanism. But I'm always torn between reality and the ideational or the desire of Africanism. Because in most cases, you see some of the action of this country actually goes beyond the so-called agreement, what they agreed to achieve. And the same thing can be said about autonomous weapon system. There was a common African position against autonomous weapon system. When our latest research, we discovered that at least 19 African countries have certain weapons that have capability or that have a varying degree of autonomy. So, and we are agreeing. So beyond the agreement, we have to wake up to reality as well. And our approach to Pan-Africanism has to be multidimensional. At the level of African Union, at the level of cooperation of few countries coming together, it can be expanded. But we have to start from somewhere. Even if it is two countries working together at a time, At a point, they can expand. More countries can show interest, and then we can expand and expand. Then African Union can take the initiative. That this is a workable and functional cooperation that can be transformed. Thank you so much.
Wow. Well, this is quite it's a lot to take in. Thank you so much, everybody. We are out of time, but I think Shadrach's hand was up, and I think there's a question for him as well on the chat from Tando. So if you want to just briefly talk about that, and then we'll take a closing remark from all our speakers to round up the day. Thank you, Shadrach. Yes. So just answer the question and then your parting words as well. Thank you so much.
Okay, so the question says, what trends have you seen that impede Africa from moving beyond plans and paper to action on the ground, especially the EU? So at the AU level, it's more of trickling down the various plans onto the ground, and it takes a lot more than just AU taking action. Because mind you, AU is a constellation of different countries, and AU is as capable as countries will make it. So it's about multilateralism. AU is formed out of countries relinquishing aspects of their sovereignty to the AU. So it's out of the willingness of countries to ensure that the AU works. And these countries are highly fragmented and highly entangled to bigger political entanglement within the geopolitical space. So we have countries who have key allies with the UAE, with Turkey, with China, with Russia. It will only take the tacit approval of these states to ensure that the AU is able to work to implement its plans at a broader scheme of things. So it's not only about we looking at AU and saying that AU is not working. AU can only work when countries are willing for the AU to work. It's like the United Nations.
Yeah.
The United Nations has not been able to stop countries like Russia, has not been able to limit the activities of Israel, because it's the willingness of those states to empower the UN.
Mm.
So for Africa to move forward, it will take the tacit and the willingness of African countries to give power to the AU. So that was why at the eve of the formation of the Organization of African Unity, someone like Nkrumah made mention of Africa uniting in terms of our political spheres. We integrating our political power together for the purposes of the broader picture of Pan-Africanism. And that didn't materialize. States wanted to still maintain their autonomy, and we still want the AU to operate as it has said in the books. So it's more of the willingness of states to ensure that multilateralism takes place, so that policies that are put on paper is able to be implemented by the AU.
Yeah, fair enough. Thank you so much, Shadrach. Thanks for joining us for this call. Absolutely, I agree with you on the last point. The strength of the AUC, even with regards to the African Space Agency, it's totally reliant on member states working together. So hopefully our Pan-Africanism in space is internally driven. But with the conversations today, I think everybody has seen that tension. And yes, just to take final comments from Max, Samuel, and Arnold in that order. Thanks for joining us today. Any parting words as we round up the conversation?
Okay, yeah, so thank you again for hosting this wonderful event. It was really an honor to be part of the panel, and I learned a great deal about Pan-Africanism. So my specialty is more in regional cooperation in general, not in the space field, but not necessarily other aspects of Pan-Africanism. So I really enjoyed learning about that facet. I think that will enrich my future research as well. And closing words. So I think based on the recent inauguration of African Space Agency and the great interest that was generated in Africa by that event, I think the future is looking very bright for space activities in Africa. And some challenges, I think, include commercialization and supporting private industry. Maybe that will be one challenge in the near future, and balancing sub-regional arrangements with continental level ones, another one. So some challenges remain, but overall, I think the direction is very promising for space in Africa. So thank you very much, and thank you again for having me.
Thank you so much, Max. It was good to have you here. And I see all the questions, the answers you've given on the chat, very extensive and elaborate. So you saved us a lot of time as well. So thank you so much for that. And Samuel, please.
Thank you so much for having me. And I think I've also gained a lot of knowledge from this interaction. Especially the legal perspective is one area I often pay lesser attention to. So I really appreciate that perspective coming from Dr. Arnold. Its background in politics and military study, I pay more attention to geopolitics, and that perspective is actually refreshing, and I think it should help me going forward in my thinking about Pan-Africanism. And I would like to appreciate other panelists and Maxi for your perspective from different other part of the world on regionalism, as well as Dr. Shadrach on issue of Pan-Africanism. The historical reflection is also very refreshing. Thank you so much, Nelly, for having us.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Samuel. I'm sorry my camera is off. I'm just trying to share the link that I put up before. And Arnold, you want to go with your parting words, please? Thank you so much.
Yes, of course. As an academic, I'll take every opportunity to speak. Thank you very much for having me, Nelly, and for putting together this very excellent panel. I want to thank the audience as well for interacting with us and for pushing our thoughts and boundaries on where we had maybe built our perspectives. So I thank you very much. My maybe one parting piece of advice to the Africans in the diaspora, to the Africans at home, is do everything in your power to contribute to the space program, however little it is. It may be writing a paper, it may be, organizing such a panel, but do it, because eventually all that builds up into the growth of capacity, the growth of competence of the professionals on the continent, but also those professionals who are interested in the continent, okay? Which is which is the only way you can actually build a space program for any continent. You have to build a critical mass of capacity and of people who are interested in the continent. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to be here, happy to do this again, and see you soon.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And I don't know if Kweko is still on the call. Our founder. Okay. I think he stepped out of the call, but he was here. So I wanted to also give it a shout out and thank him as well. Thank you so much for everybody who stayed. This was a very interesting and lengthy conversation. So we thank you so much for your time and the huge interaction as well on the group. Just before we go, if you want to join us in a group photo, and I really hope that Tando is still on the call as well to help with the photo. Okay, so let's take like a group photograph just before we end the call. So put on your cameras and join us, please. Thank you. Okay, still waiting for.
So I am on the call, but I cannot put on my camera.
Oh, okay, that's fine.
Yeah.
So can you
So
help us take the picture then?
yeah. Let me go. So
Okay.
1, 2, 3,
Just waiting for more
ready.
people to put on their camera. I think we have just
Okay.
few. If more people want to put on their camera, that would be nice. I'm just waiting. Give it like second. Okay, yeah,
it's a
that's
Saturday, so
yeah. I'm sure everybody's like lying on their couch and just like having yeah, I know. Okay, yes. Okay, thank you. Okay, all good, Tando.
okay. So 1, 2, 3. Okay.
Lovely. Thank you, Tando. Thank you so
Okay.
much, everybody. And yeah.